Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com. Join me at Sonic Cinema Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you'll get early access reviews to movies such as Suspiria, as well as this month I've done some quick takes of all of the new movies to me as far as horror movies. That are exclusive to patrons of the Patreon. That's patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. This month, I wanted to bring in somebody whom I've known for a few years. We met at the movie theater that I currently work at and he used to work at. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about our time working together was whenever we would talk about movies, and especially when we would talk about horror movies. So I thought it'd be a good idea to bring him onto the show and have just a little bit of a further discussion on the horror movie genre. Please welcome to the show Jay Barber. Thank you for joining me.
Sure, thanks for the invite.
So before we get to anything else, what drew you to the horror genre in particular?
I've definitely been fascinated by horror ever since I was a kid. Honestly, I think what sealed the deal for me, growing up, I grew up in a very religious household.
Mm-hmm.
So horror was something that was always discouraged in our house. My parents, mostly my mom, but she just hated horror growing up. Did her best to prevent us from watching anything horror related when we were at a really young age.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, when you're a kid, anytime you're told not to do something, you obviously want to do the exact opposite. So
Yeah.
as a kid, um, horror was just something that was like so mysterious to me just because I didn't really get into it very often. So anytime I was over at a friend's house, that's pretty much all we would ever do is watch horror movies. So maybe it's just because I was like doing something as a kid that I felt like I shouldn't be doing, but I'm pretty sure that's where my love of horror came from. So when I was in fifth grade over at a friend's house, I watched The Exorcist.
Mm.
And to this day, I still have never been traumatized like I was watching The Exorcist. And I'm pretty much certain that The Exorcist is the reason why I love horror so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I've bought every edition of The Exorcist on every format that's ever come out, and I have not seen The Exorcist since I was in fifth grade. I'm honestly like so nervous to watch it because I hold it in such high regards. I'm
Yeah.
just so nervous it's not going to hold up. But that is the movie I think that got me into the genre.
That's a brutal one to watch at such a young age. Man, I mean, when I was in, I think it was about third grade, I first watched the Friday 13th movie that had come out at the time, as well as like the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie. And even at that point, my mother wasn't overly conservative, but she was certainly concerned that I was so fascinated about these movies about these killers that just wouldn't die and the
Right.
supernatural aspects of that. And so I think because of that, I sort of backed away from the genre for a bit, for a number of years. But yeah, I can't imagine what was like watching. I watched The Exorcist when I was in my late teens, early 20s. So I mean, it's like so I was well prepared for what to expect for that. And yeah, that's quite an introduction to the genre.
It was an experience for sure, and I will never forget it. I mean, we had to just pause the movie every, 20 minutes or so, and I've just never been affected like that since.
Right. I certainly don't blame you. Um so that's also kind of interesting that you've owned it on like every format imaginable, but you still haven't watched it again.
Right. I'm just so
Um,
scared to, but a part of me is just dying to all of these years.
I know one of the and I brought up the Friday 13th franchise earlier, and that was one of the reasons that I kind of wanted to talk to you because of the fact that I know that's one of the conversations I enjoyed because I think around the time that we started talking at work was when I sort of started making my way back into the Friday series
Hmm.
after a long time of not really watching it, and that was around the time that the reboot came out. And so when did you? I can't remember. When did you start to? When was it you started to watch the Friday series?
So it's funny when you and I had that conversation, which was maybe only 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were both watching them around the same time. So maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, I
Yeah.
kind of, as a Halloween tradition, I would choose typically a long horror franchise to watch all the way through from start to finish
Mm-hmm.
um, every Halloween. So a lot of them actually I hadn't seen. So Friday the 13th was one that I think I'd seen the original and the remake before I decided to watch the entire series, but I had never seen any of the sequels until this point.
Yeah.
So I guess about like 4 years ago, I just decided to watch all of them. And honestly, I think, well, I will say, I think overall, as a long series, I think Nightmare on Elm Street probably has the best entries out of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
It has a couple of pretty terrible ones, but I think the quality in that franchise is a little bit better than the Friday the 13th series is.
Yeah.
There are some really bad movies in the Friday the 13th series, but it's also just a ton of fun. And what's
Mm-hmm.
so much fun about the series to me is that they just, they're so different. Like, they don't really run together as much as some other franchises.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually in the middle of rewatching the series right now,
Mm.
and the first time I watched the entire series, I remember when I got to part six, Jason Lives, and I think we talked about this.
Yeah.
Part six is by far my favorite of
Mm-hmm.
all of the sequels. And so as we speak right now, I'm actually about to watch part six. So I just got to part five this past weekend.
Yeah.
So this weekend, I will be watching Jason Lives, and I am really looking forward to it. So it's kind of interesting to watch the series again a second time. I had actually forgotten a lot about it. I don't know if you want me to avoid any spoilers, or although
No,
these are
that's all right. I mean,
pretty old at this point.
yeah, I mean they're old enough at this point where it's like if you're not expecting spoilers on something like this, I would kind of be surprised. I mean, especially if I'm talking to a filmmaker and I'm talking about their film, I'm going to be more cautious. If I'm
Right.
talking about like if I'm talking with somebody about particular movies that have been out for like 30 years, it's like you probably seen it. So,
Yeah.
um no, I mean Jason Lives is definitely probably my favorite of the sequels as well. I think I watched, not including Frey versus Jason, I've watched six of the other Friday movies this October.
Okay.
I've watched the four that I own, which are one and two, and then Jason Lives and New Blood, and then Stars. No, I and then I've watched Frey versus Jason. Then I've watched, and then Stars actually has Jason X on it.
Okay.
So I've watched all of those. So it's funny because four and five I actually have not seen since I was a kid.
Gotcha.
Six was at Jason Lives was actually the last one I watched, and that when I was in like third, fourth grade watching them, and then it was a long break before I went back to watching a Friday movie. I think Jason X
Okay.
was the first one. But I think I watched one and two every once in a while because I had those videotaped. Um, but yeah, I think Jason X was like the first one since Jason Lives that I watched that was new to me. And Yeah, Jason Lives is just such a fun movie, and it's because of the fact that it really leans into the absurdity of that franchise.
Right.
And I love, and especially the opening with Tommy Jarvis, and that's sort of a part of that franchise that's just so weird to me. Just like in the middle of the franchise with Chapter, New Beginning, and Jason Lives, they decide, oh, we need a protagonist to go against Jason,
Right.
and but I mean, it wasn't necessarily intended that way because Final Chapter was really going to be considered the final chapter. But and then the next year later they did New Beginning. But yeah, when Tommy Jarvis goes and he and his buddy go to dig up Jason and he wants to make sure he's dead and stuff like that. It's like that opening is just so crazy to me that it's like, okay, this guy's not stable, but
No.
he kind of brings it upon himself that Jason comes back.
And I think the opening scene just sets the tone so well for that movie.
Yeah.
It's kind of the first one that just doesn't really take itself very seriously, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that just works so well with the franchise.
Yeah.
And like rewatching them right now, I mean, this is pretty typical for sequels, especially in the horror genre. But starting with one, and now that I'm through five, the the practical effects and the kill scenes just keep escalating with each
Mm-hmm.
entry and getting more and more over the top, which is something that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
And then when it gets to part six, it's just like totally over the top and through the roof, and it's just so much fun.
Well, and I think it's really interesting that is written and directed by the exact same person. Like it's almost like Paramount realized that this guy had very probably pitched this idea to them, and it's like, here's my idea and I hope you let me sort of write it and direct it. And then he goes off and just it is completely in tone, it's very much unlike any of the other Friday movies, even Jason X, although even Jason X rewatching it again has a very knowing tone to it.
It
I don't think
does.
it quite succeeds as on the same level as Jason Lives does, but just because of the fact that just the idea of like these kids in their 20s being like scientists in the 25th century and all of that stuff, and the fact that it wastes David Cronenberg by having him in the opening scene only, um, is just, and it is boiled down to the humor in Jason Lives, where that movie really finds its footing, and it's like it's so wink wink at the camera at times that it's just a lot of fun.
Right. And it's really the first time that we get to see that in the series.
Yeah. I will say I've always looked at, I do love the first movie. I love the first two movies. I always sort of think of them as part of the same story, cuz two very much builds off of what happened in part 1, and I think part 1 very much is and I think one of the things that's so great about part 2 is that it just really feels like it makes part 1 a better movie because of the fact that it's very much a direct sequel, very much deals with Jason, even though it's kind of ridiculous that he would, survive for all that time after having drowned. But I feel like there's kind of a connection there with him when it comes to his mother, that is, it just brings something out of one when you put them both together.
Right. Yeah, I think part two is pretty much like the perfect continuation of the first, and I actually think it's a better movie overall.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get to part three, which I think is by far the worst of the first six,
Yeah.
it's really the only one that I just don't care for in the
Mm-hmm.
first half of the franchise. But A lot of it, I think, has to do with just the gratuitous um, 3D shots
Yeah.
sprinkled throughout the entire movie.
Well, and it also doesn't help because I rewatched 3 for the first time in like 3 decades last year when it was on Stars, and I just like there are only two reasons that 3 should really are really worth watching at all, and that's because that's the one where he gets the hockey mask, and
Hmm.
you have that kind of awesome, insane disco version of the theme song at the beginning. Those are the only two reasons you should ever watch 3 at all. Like 3 is you're right. I mean, 3 is definitely the worst of the 6, and I think it's also because of the fact it's because the characters are just the cannon fodder for Jason is just not interesting and not likable at all. In addition to
No.
the 3D effects being so 3D shots being so painfully obvious.
Right. And there are just so many pointless characters in that movie.
Yeah.
Mostly just the group of people that they run into at that convenience store. I mean, just totally pointless characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And 7, I will say, like 7 through 10, like it was a while. I it was about a decade ago, I think, before when I finally watched 7, 8, 9, and I was pleasantly surprised watching all of those. Just how much I was interested in those movies, how much they held my interest. I mean, I think
Really?
New Blood I think works as it's one of my favorite. It is one of my favorite sequels. Um, and it's because of the fact that the main girl Tina and that character. If it were just a story about that character, it would be interesting. And then the way you have Jason be a part of that is it brings the entertainment level up to it. I think.
I'll be interested to give them a second shot. Of all of the sequels, the last time I did this, I remembered really disliking Jason Goes to Hell and Jason Takes Manhattan. So I'll see how I feel this time around. But once again, Jason X came in to save the day, just like just like Jason Lives did. As soon as things
Yeah.
started to kind of get like normal and routine, those two movies just
Well, okay. I will admit that I agree with you on Jason Takes Manhattan. I remembered like I even though I didn't watch it in my teens, I always just loved that title, Jason Takes Manhattan.
hmm.
I wanted to watch it for the longest time. I didn't. But when I did, God, was that movie terrible. And it wasn't just because of the fact that he doesn't get to Manhattan, better known as I think Toronto's where they or Ontario, I
Right.
think is where they shoot. I can't remember. But until like 20 minutes into at the end of the movie, it's like you've got to be kidding me. Really, this is it's such a tease of a title, and then it doesn't really pay off. Yeah, and Jason Goes to Hell. I think it's interesting, but yeah, for the most part, it's pretty lame movie. I'm curious to watch it again for a second time at one point. I will admit I didn't like Jason X when I first saw it. I really kind of thought it was a terrible movie, and to a certain extent, it still kind of is. But it's really fun because of just how ridiculous it is.
It
And
is. I think I had the same reaction the first time I saw it. I was not a fan at all,
yeah,
but I think once you understand what you're in for,
mm,
it's just a really fun movie to watch.
yeah, and I do like that you liken it to Jason Lives because of the fact that it's like it is sort of that, oh well, the franchise is taking itself too seriously. It's like, oh, we need to get away from that. Um, and and so then that brings us to Frey versus Jason, which I've always really liked. I
Same
thought
here.
they really did a good job with that team up, and I've watched it a few times now, and I love the way they meshed I love the way they brought together the two worlds and the way they brought J- Jason the Jason formula into that movie, as well as playing with the Nightmare on Elm Street formula as well.
Yeah, it's still so surprising to me that that was even able to happen.
Yeah.
Just with so many different people involved, I'm just blown away that that even managed to be a thing. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like you said, it could have been just terrible, and the fact that it's not, I think, is maybe why I enjoy it so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really entertaining movie.
Yeah, and I remember I watched that opening weekend when it came out in theaters, and I just remember being really I remember being very pleased with how that turned out. And it's like
Hmm.
it's still, and like I said, I've watched it a few times now, and it's just I really enjoy the way they worked into that. I mean, I think they sort of tried to make too much of the different ways that Jason and Freddy have died, as far as, oh, this is the key to defeating them. But it's like it's just the way that they were able to be respectful to both franchises in a way that was still a lot of fun. I is
Right.
And the fact that you do have Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger in that movie, I mean that right there, it's like you had to have that happen, otherwise it wasn't gonna work as well as it did.
I think he was recently quoted as saying he's possibly interested in doing one more. I don't know if that was his way of potentially sharing some news, but
Yeah, yeah, and it's like I've seen chatter on that on about that on Twitter recently with the new Halloween just coming out this weekend, where it's like, the idea of having one more nightmare movie with Robert Englund, and it's like I'm curious who you would get to direct it, um, because I was not a fan of the 2010 reboot.
no, it was just
Um,
horrible.
I and it wasted like Jackie Earl Haley as Freddy Krueger, and it's like when they announced that casting, I loved it because it's like it was coming off of Watchmen, and it's like that is such a good casting, and they just stranded him with a terrible. Like it was basically it felt like the shot for shot remake of Psycho to a certain extent, where it's like it's so pointless and unnecessary to do this movie.
Right. And then on top of that, I mean, one of the best things about the first Nightmare on Elm Street are the practical effects. And so
Yeah.
to basically try and do the exact same effects, but instead of using the infinitely more impressive practical effects, you're going to just do CG.
Yeah.
And it was just so painful.
But yeah, I'm curious if that does happen. I'm curious who they would get to direct it. It's a shame that Wes isn't around anymore to direct it, because
Hmm.
but I mean, honestly, I kind of felt like he probably said everything he wanted to say with the character in New Nightmare, which I still really love.
Sure.
Um, and then as far as Friday 13th goes, we come to the 2009 reboot, which I think you and I are both fans of.
Yes.
Yeah. I love it because of the fact that it's like it pays tribute to the way the story started before basically turning into a typical Friday 13th movie.
Right. And again, I keep going back to them, but I feel like it again had the similar tone to Jason Lives and not so much Jason X,
Yeah.
but I just think it's so extreme in every sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought it was a blast, and it's been a while since I've seen it, so I'm looking forward to watching it again. But one thing that I do remember being really surprised by the first time I saw it in theaters was you're introduced to a cast of characters who were then all killed off about 30 minutes later, and you realize that was the opening sequence. And
Yeah.
I, I will never forget that because I just could not believe that they spent that much time to introduce us to these characters that honestly weren't that terrible,
Yeah.
and then to kill all of them off, and then we were introduced to the actual cast. It was an interesting choice.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it, and to my shame, I still haven't purchased it. I really want to, because I have always really liked it, and I thought Marcus Nispel directed that, and he had also directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, which I was not a fan of.
Really?
Yeah, I wasn't a fan of the 2003 one. And I think it's partially because of the fact that I just watched Toby Hooper's one for the first one for the first time,
Okay.
and like shortly before that remake came out, and just like the Toby Hooper one's just such a blunt force instrument. It's
It
just
is.
like I couldn't get past the fact that I felt like the reboot was too neatly shot.
Yeah, like polished. I know
That was
exactly
too
what you mean.
polished. Like it really needed to be grimy. It really needed to be uh no budget, just take no prisoners. And it's like I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that kind of frustrated me about that. And it's like with Friday 13th, I don't think you necessarily have to. I felt like what he did with that movie, what he did with that movie, I think it worked. And part of it is because of the fact that the way they wrote it, and the fact that you pay tribute to, you kind of remake the first one in like the first 10 minutes or so with the mother and all of that stuff, and then you sort of go off and do your own thing. And it's like that's one of the things that I really liked about it. I mean, I think it was around the time that you and I started talking about Friday the 13th. Isn't that when they first started talking about like this crazy idea that they were going to do a found footage one?
Yeah, it's just bizarre. That was a couple of years ago. I want to say originally it was supposed to come out like January of 2016 or something,
Oh
and
yeah.
then
Yeah,
it
it
got
was
to be
years
like,
ago, and I think part of what's held that up, which I've recently been reading about, is there's been legal back and forth between Victor Miller, who wrote the original script for Friday, and Sean S. Cunningham, who produced and directed it, and there's been
right.
legal hassling between them. So I think that's part of what's been holding it up.
And
Um,
unfortunately, another casualty of that um, situation, the uh, the Friday the 13th video game actually,
yeah,
I had helped kickstarted it a few years ago when that was announced,
hmm
and it was actually like a great idea, and it could have been a ton of fun, but it was pretty buggy on its release. But
yeah,
the developers had been actively working on improving everything in the game up until about a month ago. They
yeah,
basically let everyone know that they were given a cease and desist and could no
hmm
longer work on the game, and they had
yeah,
actually future plans for it as well.
yeah. And I've heard about the game, and it's like that's unfortunate to hear. That's a casualty of it, because it's like, and it's funny because I do remember the old Nintendo Entertainment System Friday 13th game, which was bizarre and weird and kind of awful. Not ET the extraterrestrial game awful, but definitely up there in the cheese factor. But yeah, I've heard good things about that game, and it's funny because of the fact that I know the lawsuit was recently. Victor Miller ended up winning that lawsuit, although I know Cunningham's appealing it. It's funny because yesterday I started to see news that LeBron James's production company might be doing a reboot of Friday 13th,
Okay.
and I'm kind of curious about that. And it's like it's funny because I saw a couple people on Twitter jokingly talk about how maybe like he should mash up like the Friday 13th reboot with his Space Jam sequel that he's producing, and it's like I could see that working in a completely absurd way.
I actually totally forgot about that Space Jam sequel.
Yeah. But that mashup probably won't happen, but it's something that I kind of feel like should happen
I
now.
know. Speaking of mashups, I know there were rumors years ago of a Leprechaun versus Chucky film, and
Oh
that
wow.
would be incredible. It's unfortunate that that never came to be.
Yeah. I mean the I think the one sequel the one sequel I think I've really wanted above anything else as far as horror genre is I really would have loved for them to be able to do at Jason versus Frey versus Ash. But I know
Gotcha.
Sam Raimi put the kibosh on that. But it's
Mhm.
like throwing Bruce Campbell into that mix would have been just absolutely awesome, I think.
Well, speaking of Evil Dead, that's another remake that I might get some flack for this, but the Evil Dead remake I thought was unbelievable. And if I was, given the choice between watching the original or the remake, I honestly have to go for the remake. I think I enjoy it more than the first.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't know how much flack you would get for that because of the fact that I personally wasn't as big a fan of the remake. I mean, it certainly I think did some interesting things, but overall I wasn't a big fan of it. But I've seen people who are fans of the remake, and certainly the director Fede Alvarez,
Right.
who a couple years ago did "Don't Breathe," which was a terrific uh,
Hmm.
thriller. Um, I yeah, I mean, I've heard some good. I like I said, I wasn't a huge fan of the Evil Dead remake, but I mean, I have, I'm a fan of the original Evil Dead trilogy. It's been a while since I've seen Army of Darkness, but I always watch Evil Dead 2, because Evil Dead 2 is just so awesomely ridiculous and fun.
It is.
Um, and it's been a few years since I've watched Evil Dead, but it's partially because of the fact that it's pretty intense compared to the first one. Compared to the second one, I'm so used to the weird, whacked out comedy of the sequel,
Right.
and so it's been a few years since I've watched the original Evil Dead. And I've seen a few episodes of Ash versus Evil Dead, and that was fun.
That was something I should have given a chance to. I think I only ever saw the very first episode, and that's it.
Yeah, I know part of the reason why I have a hard time getting into Ash versus Evil Dead is because of the fact that it's like that debuted like right around the time I was getting married, so it's like I kind of like had other things on my mind, so I couldn't quite get into it. And we didn't have cable, but I mean we do have the Stars app, so it's like I can go back and rewatch it. But and I do want to at some point. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean the Evil Dead. I've noticed on social media that it's like people do enjoy the Evil Dead remake, and it's not without its charms. It's definitely technically terrific movie. It's really well directed.
What's interesting is they're choosing to just now release the unrated cut on Blu-ray, which I think comes out this week.
Mm.
So I don't even know if I knew that there was an unrated cut, and I think it's just kind of funny to think that there was footage that was removed from the cut that we saw,
Yeah.
in theaters. Just kind of cracks me up because of how outrageous it is. But
Yeah.
that'll be interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know one of the things that one of my favorite memories was some friends of mine and I went to see Bruce Campbell, and he was at the Midtown Art Theater in downtown Atlanta, and he was doing a Q&A and stuff before debuting his debut film, The Man with a Screaming Brain.
Nice.
And that was around the time they first started talking about like an Evil Dead remake or Evil Dead 4 and stuff like that. And I remember one of the most memorable things I will ever have in my life is having Bruce Campbell in a packed theater talk about the prospect of remaking Evil Dead and saying how many of you want to see would love to see Ashton Kutcher get raped by a tree. And I think if I remember correctly, you know Jeffrey Butzer. He was one of the friends there.
Okay.
He was there too, and yeah, that was something that had
I'm
everybody
sure
just
everyone just lost it.
yeah, it was insane because that was right around the time that Ashton Kutcher was kind of at his peak celebrity, I think. Um, what other you mentioned that you have a tendency you tend to watch horror franchises every you tend to watch franchises in their entirety. What are some of your other favorite franchises?
Um, let's see. Other than the big ones, um, I think the last few I watched all the way through. A couple years ago, I watched. There are only four, but the Wishmaster series.
Okay.
Something I'd always wanted to see. The first two are a ton of fun, and the second two are just god awful. um, I watched the Rex series, which was also a lot of fun. I'd seen Quarantine before I saw the original, and the original is just insanely intense.
Mhm.
Same with the sequel, but that was a fun series. A series that I keep meaning to watch because I love the first two so much. And I know most of the sequels are just considered pure trash, but I keep meaning to sit down and watch all of the Hellraiser films. And I
Mm.
think they're like a new Hellraiser just came out. So I think there's something like 13 or 14
Yeah,
Hellraiser
I
movies at
I
this
don't know
point.
how that franchise. Yeah, it's. I think I've only seen the original Hellraiser, and it's one that I kind of want to watch again this month because I watched that one movie Mandy that came out
Hmm.
last month with
I'm dying
Nicolas
to see
Cage,
it.
and it's a fascinating movie, and it reminded me and the friend of mine and I that I watched it with. Uh, it reminded both of us immediately thought of Clive Barker and Nightbreed and Lost and Lore of Illusions and
Okay.
he's basically produced the Hellraiser franchise and he directed the first one
Right.
and so I've been because of Mandy. I've been meaning to rewatch at least a couple of his movies, and I know the original Hellraisers on Netflix, as well as I think a few others.
Hmm.
But yeah, I've never seen any of the sequels to that. It's like I don't know. Like I have so many movies that I have to watch that it's like the idea of going through an entire franchise is difficult
I
to
know.
do. Like it's funny as far as the we I mentioned Halloween. The new Halloween came out. I've only seen like the original Halloween, H2O, and now this new one.
Okay.
So it's like I know the rest of the movies are mostly kind of terrible based on reputation, but I'm curious to see at least the second and the third movie, but I just don't necessarily know if I have the patience to watch through all of them.
Yeah,
But
it's also a really fun series. And just with Friday and Nightmare, there are just a couple of really bad ones. But I mean, for the most part, there was really only one Halloween movie that I just thought was unwatchable, and it was Resurrection.
yeah,
You know, when like a rapper is your headliner, that's usually not a great sign.
yeah.
But it was just terrible.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. What are some of your favorite recent horror movies?
I think The genre has gotten some really good entries in the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in like the early 2000s, it was just mostly filled with a lot of really tame PG-13 horror that was just so generic.
Yeah.
But lately, we've gotten some interesting ones. I think the ones that have really stuck with me are It Follows, The Witch,
Yeah.
uh, the first Conjuring.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I did see Halloween this weekend and definitely loved it.
Yeah. No, I thought they did a really good job of doing that story as far as like what would Laurie Strode be like 40 years after. I mean, I think there are some parts about it that I think there are some things about it that don't work quite as well as others. Like I kind of wanted the investigative journalist to like bite it right quickly. Especially the guy, he was pretty obnoxious when he uh, at the beginning when they were in the facility. But overall, I thought they did a really good job with that. I would agree with that.
And I feel like I'm forgetting a couple that have been recent. A Quiet Place was really good,
Mm-hmm.
and that was this year.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's some big ones from the past few years that I'm forgetting.
What about it? What do you think of it?
So it had been a long time since I'd seen the original. And honestly, the original's so long that I think I only ever caught bits and pieces of it as a kid whenever
Mm-hmm.
it was just on TV. And I don't
Yeah.
even know that I saw it like from beginning to end ever. So the only thing I really even remember about the original is just Tim Curry's performance,
Yeah.
which is obviously incredible. But
Mm-hmm.
so I loved the new It, and I haven't
Yeah.
seen it since it was in theaters, and have been meaning to give it a another watch. But
Mm-hmm.
I thoroughly enjoyed the new one.
Yeah, I really I've been a fan of the main series for a long time with Tim Curry, and yeah, I thought I thought chapter one was fantastic. I'm really looking forward to the see to chapter two next year.
Yeah, and I guess the official cast has been announced at this point.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that cast in itself, it's like James McAvoy, Jessica Chastain, and Bill Hader are
Hmm.
like I can't wait to see Bill Hader in a horror movie. Like
I
I'm
know.
so fascinated what that's gonna be like. Have you seen Hereditary yet?
That's okay. That was one that I was forgetting to mention. That is probably the only horror movie that has affected me in a really long time. I was
Yeah.
seriously disturbed by it, which is nothing
Mm-hmm.
but praise.
Yeah.
I was just blown away, and
Mm-hmm.
something that still has stuck with me. I was just so surprised watching in theaters that, and I don't even have to say really what happened because I'm sure you know what I'm talking
Oh
about. But
yeah.
that
Yeah.
moment that happens about halfway through the movie,
Mm-hmm.
um, is such a huge moment, and I'm just so relieved and surprised that the marketing team decided to not reveal that in the trailer. I mean, I know
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been in the trailer, but they didn't even hint that that was going to happen in the movie. So I think that is
Oh
just what
yeah.
caught me up. But I still think about that scene since I saw that movie.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm absolutely the exact same way when it comes to that moment in the movie. Hereditary is probably the best feature I've seen this year.
Mhm.
It just I think it is a movie that's as the years go on, it will very much solidify itself in the same way The Shining did, in the same way The Exorcist has, in that it's just such a gut punch, and especially that one scene that you're talking about. And there are not many moments in cinema, in movies, that not only audibly made me gasp, but have just left me in bewilderment for minutes afterwards.
For sure,
And
that is exactly how I felt the entire
yeah,
the entire
and
time.
it wasn't even just that particular moment. It was what Ari Aster does afterwards. The
Right.
way that unfolds, it's like, oh my word. It like, and it's like I rented it from Netflix because I haven't bought it yet and I want to. I'm going to. But I rented it from Netflix, and then my sister-in-law, one who's a horror fan, we saw the new Halloween with her this past weekend. She wanted to see it, so so I let her borrow it, and by prepared her. It's like it's a gut punch. It's really a gut punch. It's like I'm very curious to see what she thinks about it because, yeah, it's and that and you mentioned the marketing team about that with that movie. The fact that like when I wanted to see the movie based on the trailers, but I was expecting something along the lines of your typical creepy kid type movie. And
Right.
it's like, oh my god, this is so not that.
No, not at
um
all.
but yeah, no, Hereditary is astonishing. And I mean it's definitely a gold standard bearer for the genre right now.
Yeah, and so I like what you said about it a few minutes ago, how you feel it's going to stand the test of time next to some of the other horror greats, and
Yeah.
that's something that I think about a lot whenever I'm watching something. Is I just like to, I don't know, try and think like, when The Shining came out or The Exorcist, like when people were sitting in that theater watching it opening
Mm-hmm.
night, like I just wonder if afterwards, like, did they know like how big of an impact that movie was going to have on the future of the genre? And
Yeah.
I think about that all the time watching, modern movies, and I think that Hereditary might be one of those.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I can say just based on what I know about like the history of those two movies, The Exorcist definitely did because I mean it was, and the thing is that was a serious movie. It wasn't just oh it's a cheapo horror movie. No, that was a prestige movie for Warner Brothers. It was a big hit too. The Shining, I I know it was polarizing at the time. It at the it's grown in reputation. I think partially because of the fact that means Kubrick's movies have a tendency to do that, and then also just the fact that it's like it feels there's very little like it even now, and it's one of the most I would say it's one of the most definitive haunted house movies ever.
Definitely.
And I mean, it's definitely for me personally, it's my favorite horror movie of all time. It's been that way for many years and will remain that way. There's just so much about that movie that has just impacted me. The use of music, the use of sound, the use of cinematography, and the use of the Steadicam, and the use of Jack Nicholson. And it's like it's easy for to look at The Shining and go, oh well, it's like he starts off, he ramps up to 11, but he's already at like 6 or 7 when the movie starts. But it's like, but that's what's fun about Jack is just, and there are moments, and like sort of in Hereditary and The Exorcist, there are moments in The Shining where, you know, yeah, there are moments that are just wildly entertaining by Jack Nicholson. There are also moments where he scares the bejesus out of you
Right.
in that movie, especially when especially when Wendy's backing up with the bat before she puts him in the meat locker in the locker, and he like that is one of the scariest performances I think any actor has given in a horror film.
It is. I mean, the acting is incredible in The Shining, and it's just so unrelentingly bleak the entire time, which I
Yeah.
think is its strongest point.
Mm-hmm. What are some of your favorite horror movies? I mean, we've touched on a couple, I know, but what are some of your favorite horror movies?
Um, Other than the big ones, the original Pulse, which was called Cairo, I've
Mm-hmm.
always loved. I've only seen it a couple of times, but every time I watch it, I'm just blown away. Obviously, the American remake was
Yeah,
pretty terrible. I don't know if you saw it.
I think that's what Jessica Alba, isn't it?
Kristen Bell,
Oh, okay. I don't
Kristen Bell, and
remember if
Ian
I've
Somerhalder.
I don't remember if I've seen it.
It's pretty awful. But the original is amazing, and I would definitely recommend it.
No, the
Um,
Eye's the one that I'm thinking of with Jessica Alba. That was
that's
remade
right.
with her.
Right.
Yeah.
The I think this is one of those movies that again was one of the few that affected me when I saw it. But The Ring is still
Mm-hmm.
like probably my top 10.
Yeah.
Uh, and while I don't know that it's technically horror, um, it really hit me pretty hard the first time I saw it. But I've seen it, like 50 times at this point.
Yeah.
But I still am just blown away, mostly just by, I mean, the pacing, the cinematography, the acting. I mean, the movie is like beautiful from start to finish, and it's
Yeah.
such a fun mystery.
You're talking
Uh,
about the Gore Verbinski one with Naomi Watts, right? Or are you
I
talking about
am.
Ringu?
Honestly, I prefer the American version to Ringu.
Yeah. I'm the same way.
I really do think
Yeah.
it's a better film.
Yeah. I mean, I thought the first sequel, I thought The Ring 2 was all right. It wasn't nearly as good as the first one. I'm with you. I love Verbinski's film. I it's probably my favorite PG-13 horror movie.
Agreed.
It's such a great use of the genre, and it doesn't go too far, and it makes it work.
And that's what's
That
so
way.
interesting is they got Hideo Nakata, the original director of
Yeah.
Ringu, to then direct The Ring 2, which was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a great movie, but it had its moments.
Yeah. And it's I and yeah, when Rings came out last year, it was just not that good. I think, and the thing is, I think part of it is I think that concept's so hard to translate to now. Like you can't it's hard to do something like that with social media being the way it is.
So there was a short film on the bonus features of The Ring, and the short
Yeah.
film was called Rings. Did you see that? I'm sorry, it was
I'm
attached to the Ring 2's DVD.
Oh, okay. No, I haven't seen that.
Okay, so that is actually incredible. It was better
Hmm.
than the Ring 2 was, and it was just in the special features. So it's a 20-minute short called Rings that was supposed to bridge the gap between the first and the second, and it is amazing.
Okay.
And the new Rings, as soon as I saw that that's what they were calling it, I wondered if they were going to go the same route that this short film did, and they
Hmm.
sort of went that way. But I seriously recommend watching it.
Okay.
It's such a good idea. They basically there's like this underground group of kids, pretty much, who are watching the tape themselves, and then they're seeing how far they can go before basically giving up. So everyone has 7 days before they're going to die, but they try and see how far they can get because their hallucinations
Hmm.
get more and more like visceral each day. And so but they have this group set up where they have like a buddy system basically, and so before someone watches the tape, they get someone else to basically promise that they will watch their copy when they tell them to save their life.
Hmm.
So it's a really cool idea, but obviously it's about the main character whose buddy ends up, bailing on him.
Yeah.
That's where the Ring 2 actually starts, if you remember how the Ring 2 starts.
Yeah, I think so. It's been a while since I've seen The Ring too.
It's amazing, and I would definitely recommend watching that short.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I wasn't a huge fan of Rings last year when that came out. It's like, it was just very. It wasn't that good.
I thought the
Um,
opening sequence on the plane was such a cool idea, but that is like the only part in the movie that I loved.
yeah. Um, what do you? I can't remember. What? Because I feel like we must have talked about it. Um, what? How do you feel about the Blair Witch Project, and then your sort of thoughts on found footage in general?
I'm trying to remember when I first saw the Blair Witch Project. I did not see it when it first came out, although I was aware of it when it came out.
Yeah.
I mean, this will show my age, but I was in first grade when the Blair Witch came out, and I don't even know why I remember I was in first grade. But I mean, even back then, like I was just so fascinated by horror because it was something that I just couldn't really experience at that time.
Right.
So I would like hear about the Blair Witch Project all the time. Even like the kids I went to school with, they're
Yeah.
first graders, and
Yeah.
they're talking about this movie that I kept hearing about. Who knows how many of them had actually seen it, but I kept hearing about this Blair Witch everywhere as a kid. And so I honestly can't even remember when I finally ended up watching it, but I do remember just thinking like I wasn't even back then, like I wasn't sure if what I was hearing, if
hmm
if it was just a movie or not. And I just remember hearing about like the articles online. And again, the marketing team just, I
Yeah.
mean, they killed it. That was like for sure why it was such a success.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I remember, man, that really shows the age disparity between us. For you mentioned that you were in first grade when the Blair Witch came out. It's like I think I was in my going into my fourth year of college. Um, I remember like I was knee deep into movies at that point. I was obsessed with movies. I was writing about movies and all of that. And when Blair Witch came out, it's like I remembered that came out the same that started its run in limited release the same week as Eyes Wide Shut came out. And I saw it. So I saw Eyes Wide Shut over the weekend, and then that Monday I had summer classes. I finished up those summer classes. I basically rushed to the Terror 4 in Buckhead, which is
Okay.
the only theater that was playing at. And there was a line for the movie. And it was all about the Blair Witch because I think they had on two screens. And they were only the only place in town that had it. And I think I ended up in the fifth row from the front at Terra in like one of their biggest auditoriums. And if you've ever been to the Terra, you know how big their biggest auditoriums are. It's
Right.
massive. And so the idea that was like 5 rows from the front, that was freaky. That was freaky, even for somebody who was going on 22 at that age at that time. It was just it had that impression on me, and I ended up not seeing. I saw it a few more times in theaters because I really loved it, and then I completely bypassed Book of Shadows the next year for a variety of reasons, not the least of which because of the terrible reviews, which were justified after I saw the movie finally. Um, and then I actually did like the way they did Blair Witch a couple of years ago. The reboot of it. I thought was interesting.
It was It was interesting, and before I go any further, I just remembered that Blair Witch came out in 1999. I don't know where first grade came from. I was 10 years old in 99,
Okay.
so
Okay,
disregard
now I
that. I
don't
was
feel
not.
quite as old.
I
Um,
don't know where that came from. But yeah, so the new Blair Witch, it it did a lot of things right.
yeah.
One of the things that I thought it did very wrong was to completely go against. one of the strongest points of the original, and that's that less is more, and
Yeah.
they end up showing the witch, which I think was not a good idea at all.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's completely fair. It's like no, I wouldn't. I I enjoyed Blair Witch. I thought it was a decent sequel, but yeah, you're right. I mean, less is more is definitely not in that movie's cards. But the fact of the matter is, it's like I think that we were talking about rings and trying to update that premise. Is like I felt like they kind of did a decent job of trying to update the Blair Witch premise for modern day
Hmm.
technology and stuff like that. Because I mean, let's face it, modern day technology, you kind of have to go out of your way to get lost.
Right.
With GPSs on our phones and all of that stuff, you kind of have to go on out of your way to get lost. So, um, the way that they brought in sort of supernatural elements into it, I think was a decent job. It's I think it kind of met my expectations, such as they were, but it's like I wouldn't necessarily say more than that.
Right. And with the whole found footage documentary, even after it had been just completely overdone to death, there are still some occasionally that will surprise me, and I'm surprised that that genre is still even a thing.
Yeah,
But they're still getting made, and occasionally something comes out that is really great. I think the last mockumentary that I think is just incredible is actually The Last Exorcism.
yeah.
Um, Love The Last Exorcism. Um, I just recently rewatched, and it's a really fun movie. Is As Above, So Below.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's this movie, I don't know if you've seen it, called Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
Robert England is in it. It's a really smart movie, but it's similar to Scream, where it's just breaking down the tropes of the genre.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about a documentary crew that interviews someone who's basically a Freddy or a Michael or a Jason, and
Right.
they're asking him like how do you like pick your victims and stuff like that, and he goes into detail, and they even follow him on some of his kills. It's actually a really smart movie. It's a lot of fun.
Okay. All right. What did you think of Sinister?
I was so excited about Sinister. I thought the trailer was incredible. A really frightening premise, and I was completely let down. And I know there are people that love Sinister,
Yeah.
and I have not seen it since it was in theaters. I think as far as I remember, I thought the first half was really strong, and then the second half was just awful.
Hmm.
Um, Towards the end, when all of these like ghost kids show up, I was like completely done with the movie.
Yeah. Okay, I was curious about that because I am somebody who really likes Sinister, but yeah, I can kind of see how the second half of it, would sort of be. Yeah, the first half of it is definitely more interesting, and yeah, once you start getting into the second half, where it's a little bit more traditional horror and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean
Hmm.
I can kind of see that, and because I kind of feel like that sort of was when I saw Sinister 2 a couple of years later. It was like some of the things that were really good about Sinister, in my opinion, and then a lot of stuff that I wasn't that big a fan of in Sinister. So yeah,
Well, something that I love about its premise so much, it's kind of similar to The Ring in that it's, I guess, ultimately about like evil, like living
yeah,
in film and media,
mm-hmm.
and there's just so much that you can do with that.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I think I follow C. Robert Cargill, who was the co-writer on Sinister, and he mentioned recently on his Twitter feed that when he was pitching the idea, like the way he pitched it was, it's like this, you've heard of found footage movies. It's like this is about the guy who finds the footage,
Hmm.
and it's like, yeah, I mean, it's a good hook. It's an interesting hook, definitely. And but yeah, you're absolutely right as far as the that and the Ring having that in common as far as evil being on film and media and just sort of existing while also sort of cursing the person that watches it.
Right.
Yeah.
And now that I think about it, there are two other mockumentaries I really enjoyed over the past few years. There's one called Grave Encounters, and there's a sequel also, which was terrible.
Hmm.
But the first, I think, has been on Netflix for a while. It just follows a crew of ghost hunters um, in an abandoned asylum. Really, really creepy. And then there's another one called Hell House LLC that is
Hmm.
amazing. The movie starts off with the opening night of some new haunted house, and we're like down inside the haunted house with the people, and something starts happening, and we're not quite sure what. And someone ends
Hmm.
up basically dying on the opening night of this haunted house, and so the rest of the movie um, goes back in time, and we watch, of course, the people who had set up this haunted house, recorded everything that they did. I know, not plausible in the slightest,
Yeah.
but so we get to see, everything that led up to that opening night of the haunted house, and it's actually really well done, really creepy, and I definitely recommend that.
Okay. What are some of your sort of below the radar movies that maybe people aren't as familiar with, other than the two that you just mentioned, that you would recommend?
Um, there is an Australian horror comedy I watched maybe a year ago called Housebound that is hilarious. Um, Also has some pretty creepy moments, and it's one that I need to watch again, but I would definitely recommend Housebound. It's really tough to balance horror and comedy, and it
Mm-hmm.
fails more often than it succeeds. But Housebound definitely surprised me. Really funny movie. Trying to think if there's anything else. Not the top of my head right now,
Okay.
unfortunately.
All right. Well, I mean, there are definitely a few options there for people to check out if they're so interested. What would you say is probably? I mean, we talked a lot about slashers off the bat. Would you say that's probably your favorite um style of horror, or do you have a particular favorite?
I think so, and honestly, what I love about slashers so much is I just prefer horror, like the antagonist in horror, just to be like one being rather
Mm-hmm.
than just random scares happening
Yeah.
throughout, which is usually found in like the ghost genre, haunted
Mm.
houses, stuff like that. But in slashers, they usually, well, the best slashers, they came up with a single character that is there's usually something really unique about him, like the way that he either lives or the way that he can kill people.
Yeah.
Obviously, Nightmare on Elm Street is probably just the best example.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I love about slashers so much is each one just has that unique character.
Yeah. Um. What? Okay. I'm gonna go into a little bit of a different. If you can if you can name some, what would you say are some of the worst horror films you've ever seen?
Oh man, I wish I had thought about this before now. I have
Yeah.
seen so many bad ones. Um, I mean, some of the worst ones I've ever seen are also some of my favorites.
Yeah.
So I guess if I think in that sense, um,
And that's probably a better way of that's probably a better way of bringing it up anyway. Is like, what ones do you are not good but are a lot of fun?
okay,
So
so I mean, probably the biggest, which most people have seen, but it truly is just like it has to be seen to be believed, is Troll 2.
yeah.
And even on top of that, the documentary about it, Best Worst Movie, is just
Mm,
fascinating, but also really tragic somehow.
yeah.
So that is an interesting double feature to watch for sure. There's this boutique home video label that I'm a huge fan of called Vinegar Syndrome, and they basically specialize in tracking down and rescanning the original film elements of just terrible horror films, and then giving it the Criterion treatment. So their Blu-rays are always just stunning. But what's so cool
Mhm.
about it is you're seeing this stunning presentation of just awful movies. Um, and they usually even end up tracking down the filmmakers and they get them to do new interviews. And I mean, a lot of these are movies that people love just because of how ridiculous they are. But I've been collecting a lot of their stuff lately, and one of theirs that I saw that is terrible but so much fun is called Demon Wind. Um, Demon Wind and Bloodbeat
Mm,
were both remastered by Vinegar Syndrome recently, but they're a ton of fun and just awful movies.
okay. All right. Um. Well, with that being said, I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up. I'm really glad we were able to do this conversation. Um.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun.
Yeah, and definitely want to have you back and talking more about movies in general, about horror movies we can talk about, and just all sorts of stuff.
Sounds good.
Okay. I'd like to thank Jay Barber for joining me tonight. It was a lot of fun to have him on the podcast, and I really enjoyed talking to him. I hope you enjoyed hearing him. I I definitely plan on having him back in the future because it's always fun to talk to him about movies and talk to him about horror movies in particular. Thank you very much for joining me for the Sonic Cinema podcast. Check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Um, Rewards are probably going to be a bit scarce as the holidays get nearby, but I hope to still make it worth your while with early access reviews and much more. And then when we hit 2019, it's going to be fast and furious with the podcast, with Patreon. I've got a lot of big ideas, and hopefully Jay will be a part of that. And for now, though, this is Brian Scuttle. Thank you very much for joining me at the Sonic Cinema podcast. Have a good day.